Greetings and various assorted salutations. Welcome to another lecture for U.S. history. Today we are looking at the tensions growing, kind of the prelude to the American Civil War. What are things developing into for this conflict? So, with that being said, let's dive in. Now, fundamentally, the problem is slavery is becoming the issue dividing the American public. This issue has been ignored by many of the founding fathers. It's been pushed down the line with a series of compromises. But the problem is with westward expansion, with the manifest destiny from sea to shining sea, part kind of growing the U.S. dramatically, slavery becomes an issue that is becoming harder and harder to ignore. Laconically put, rising tensions over slavery, failed compromises, and clashing ideologies steadily fractured the Union and set the stage for the American Civil War. So, first up, learning objectives. We have two learning objectives today. We're going to analyze the political, economic, and social factors that contributed to the rising tensions between the North and the South in the decades leading up to the American Civil War. And two, we're going to evaluate the effectiveness of major legislative compromises and events. For example, the Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and how these delayed or perhaps accelerated the onset of the Civil War. There's a few key terms here, just to run through them. One of the big ones that we're going to see is sectionalism, which is loyalty to interests of one's own regions, those being the North and the South, the major ones, rather than the United States as a whole. An abolitionist is a person who wants to end slavery completely in the United States of America. No slavery north or south or in the territories. Done. Gone. We have the Fugitive Slave Act, which is an 1850 law, but do be aware there are other Fugitive Slave Acts, but we mainly look at the one in 1850. This required citizens to assist with the capture of runaway slaves and punish those who helped runaway slaves. Popular sovereignty is another term that comes up. This is the idea that people living in an area should decide for themselves how that area should be run. The context we're looking at it in is, should a place be a slave area or a free area? The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This undoes the Missouri Compromise and allows popular sovereignty instead of a line on the map to decide where slavery can and can't be. This will result in the Bleeding Kansas, which we'll talk about in a bit. We have the Underground Railroad. For those who just didn't want to deal with slavery anymore, you could take the risky chance of escaping to either the North or later on, as laws get worse, all the way to Canada, We have the Dred Scott v. Sanford Supreme Court case of 1857. This court case does absolutely nothing to fix the issue of slavery, but basically in this ruling it rates African Americans as not citizens, and it prevents Congress from carrying out the banning of slavery in territories. The Republican Party comes up in this time period, in the 1850s. One of the big things they're into is banning the expansion of slavery into the U.S. territories. Some will express banning of slavery more than that. Secession is the act of leaving the United States of America. This will be led by South Carolina, followed by other states following Lincoln's election, but we're really going to talk about this concept more in the next unit on the American Civil War. Alrighty, let's get into the economic and social divides of this time period. The United States of America is very divided socially and economically. Largely what we're looking at in the divide is between North and South. There's more divides than that. For example, we have the entire frontier, and they have kind of their own mindset that we, based on where I teach, would be more interested in. But the mentality that we're looking at, the dividing America, is between northern states and southern states. Now, the northern states are going to be up here in the north. And they are going through, as pictured here, an industrial revolution. This means that cities are growing. The economy is more focused on the production and making of goods as opposed to the growing of crops or the use of slave labor. Many of these states will ban slavery or heavily restricted it, or by the time we're looking at them, outright banned it completely. These northern states are going to be going through expanding railroads, expanding telegraph lines, and the development of new technologies and new products for the American public and anybody who we can sell them to abroad. They are also pro-tariff, pro-American business. Meanwhile, the southern states are very similar to what they were, back when the country was founded. Small, isolated communities centered around agriculture. Most of the farms are small and managed by poor whites, but there is a wealthy elite class that owns a lot of slaves. They control the politics. They control a lot of the economic direction. These southern states are focused on growing cotton, tobacco, cash crops, and getting those to market. They dislike tariffs, and they believe they should buy the cheapest products from wherever they can get them, which in many cases is not the northern United States. This economic divide is going to play a huge role. Whereas slave labor was used for a lot of production in the South, in the North, industrial production required lots of factory workers. As a result, many immigrants coming to the United States would go north because that's where the jobs were. Social views on slavery. Now, we talked about abolition in the key terms, and many Americans and many around the world have become to view slavery as morally wrong or wrong for various other reasons. Now, what this amounts to is slavery is viewed as wrong for a variety of different reasons. The one that's easiest for us to understand in the present is the moral stance against slavery. There are many who believed in that famous ideal put in the founding documents of the United States that all men are created equal. Whether it's through enlightenment or religious belief, there are people who believe that owning people as property is morally wrong. And goes against the values of whether it be their religion or the founding of this nation. There's also the argument slavery is unfair economically. The use of slave labor devalued individual workers, and it meant that wealthy slave owners could dominate industries and dominate areas and hurt competition. California is probably the best example of this. The territory and later the state banned slavery because they worried that if slaves were dumped into places where gold mining is being done, the individual gold miner couldn't strike it rich because you just have these armies of slaves occupying and extracting all the wealth for their master. And so there's kind of an economic argument. Now, that being said, this is a civil dispute, a social dispute, and there are a number of people that are pro-slavery. Now, their arguments by our today's standards are very, very, disgusting and untenable is the best way of putting it. But you have to remember that this is one of those moments where the past is like a foreign country. They do things differently there. Definitely one of those moments. Some people who are pro-slavery, it's because economics. If you were a large plantation owner and had several dozen or 100 plus slaves, you were pro-slavery because that's the people who extracted your wealth. They saw slaves as property, and they defended the institution of slavery because they benefited directly from it. Plain and simple. There was also a racist element into pro-slavery people as well. There was this hierarchy of different races and slave ownership and things like that. We'll probably look at that in more detail in class to understand where that's coming from. But those are kind of two of the big reasons why there are some people who are willing to kill, fight, and potentially die to preserve the institution of slavery. Preferably the first two for them. Now, there are other reasons for and against slavery, but let's just keep it to the introduction and keep things rolling along. Now, a lot of compromises are going to be tried going all the way back to the founding of the United States of America, and they're all going to ultimately, well, spoiler alert, fail. Before antebellum period, so early United States, slavery could be handled on a state-by-state issue. Some states would ban slavery. Many of the northern states would ultimately ban slavery before the 1850s. You also have the Three-Fifths Compromise, if you remember back from learning about the U.S. Constitution. The Three-Fifths Compromise was dealing with how do we count slaves and population. This compromise basically said, well, southern states should be able to count some of their slaves, but not fully like their regular citizens. It's kind of an awkward thing to talk about when you say it out loud, and not very pleasant. But these early antebellum compromises are, they get us through the Founding Fathers period. Anyways, moving on. We also have the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and essentially the problem is the United States is an expanding nation, and more states are more and more territories are applying for statehood, and the growing question is, are they going to be a slave state or going to be a free state? And with the Three-Fifths Compromise, there's kind of this fear that if there's too many slave states, the slave states will dominate American politics. If there's too many free states, the free states will dominate American politics. It's going to be a mess. And so the Missouri Compromise, the Missouri Compromise, says, let's draw a line. Above the line, free states. Below the line, slave states. But that line being the 3630 line drawn on the map, which you learn about in geography, how those work. Maine would also be added up here as a free state. And kind of the idea for a while was for every free state we had a slave state, or vice versa. Problem is, we get more territory. So that took care of the Louisiana Purchase, but what about the territories acquired from Mexico? Mexico, to make things even more complicated, had banned slavery in their territories before the United States took them in the Mexican-American War. And so this is going to lead to quite the mess. Fortunately, we come up with the Compromise of 1850, which doesn't fix anything, but it allows us to temporarily ignore the problem. Basically, the Fugitive Slave Act is 5 bills aimed at addressing different aspects of the question and problem of slavery versus non-slavery. First one, California is a free state. Thanks to the California Gold Rush of 1849, San Francisco 49ers, California will enter as a free state. As mentioned before, they don't want slaves as competition. They're going to be pro-freedom. The Fugitive Slave Act is put in and strengthened. What this did is it required all U.S. citizens to participate in the recapturing of runaway slaves. So, if you helped runaway slaves, you got punished as well. And we'll probably look at this in more detail in class. Slave trade's banned in Washington, D.C. You can still own slaves, but you can't buy and sell slaves in that area. Not sure how that really addresses anything. Anyways, New Mexico and Utah territories will use popular sovereignty to decide whether or not they will be pro or anti-slavery. Spoiler alert, they're mostly anti-slavery. Southerners will not like this part of the compromise. Texas is going to... this one deals with Texas, and it deals with debt Texas owes. So it's in there. It's like some bills in government. It's like, yeah, we'll put this here. It's not necessarily the best connection to the other things, but we're trying to vote some stuff through. Yeah. Now, ultimately, the Missouri Compromise, or the 1850 Compromise, is not really going to do anything but annoy people. Many Northerners don't like the Fugitive Slave Act. Some states will even pass state laws that will help people not have to follow that law. And also we'll see that the Fugitive Slave Act laws are not really strictly enforced at the national level. The southern states are not thrilled at all. They feel that, well, they got a lot of things out of the initial deal. In the long run, they lose out because many of the western territories don't have pro-slavery views. But popular sovereignty is the new solution. If the federal government can't figure it out, it goes to the states or the territories. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 is going to say, let's just have the people vote on it. I mean, granted, white men are the only ones who can vote in most cases, but still, it's, we'll talk about suffrage and future units and activities. But anyways, the problem with popular sovereignty as a decision is this leads to something called Bleeding Kansas. Because what happens is, with popular sovereignty, is, okay, you're pro-slavery. Well, how do you get people to vote your way? Well, you can't compel them. So what if you try chasing them out of the territory? You can't vote if you're not there. Well, same goes for the anti-slavery people. What if we chase out the people who are voting for slavery? And this is why Kansas is called Bleeding Kansas, and a lot of fighting occurs there. Probably the most famous of these individuals involved in the Bleeding Kansas incident is John Brown. John Brown woke up and chose violence. We'll talk about him more. Now, abolition movement. The anti-slavery movement has got an uphill battle. There's a lot of people who just don't care either way about the issue of slavery, because if you're living in the North, you don't really see a lot of slaves. If you're living in the South, well, you probably benefit indirectly from slavery, and you might not question it much. However, the abolitionist movement is a growing movement that's getting louder and louder and harder to ignore. They are fueled by a lot of very smart and determined people. Men, women, freedmen, those are freed African Americans, are going to be just some of those vocal and loud voices speaking out against slavery in the coming years. Books are going to be a major source. Books like 12 Years a Slave or Uncle Tom's Cabin are going to bring the problem of slavery to the reading public. These books depict the suffering of slavery, and it humanized the slaves. That's going to help the abolitionist movement. The Underground Railroad is going to be another example of resisting slavery. Some people get involved in the Underground Railroad because they want to do good in the world. They feel that they can't do it any other way, and so by breaking the law and helping slaves escape is one of the ways that they can feel like we can solve a problem. If I can help my friend today, my brother, maybe someday more will be free. There's going to be a number of women activists as well. A number of anti-slavery individuals are also going to play a huge role in the women's rights movement that follows the American Civil War. There are a few other examples. For example, some people will take violence as a way of opposing slavery. John Brown is going to be the most famous of these. We'll look at him in more detail. John Brown will be active in Bleeding Kansas, killing, murdering, harassing, committing arson against pro-slavery people. But his most famous moment is going to be at Harper's Ferry, where he attempts to storm a U.S. arsenal, rob it, and trigger a slave revolt. Ultimately, it fails, and he's killed, but he becomes a martyr for the abolitionist movement, which detailed here. So, where is this all going? Well, chaos. The federal government has not been able to resolve the issue. Congress has not been able to find a compromise dating back as far as the Constitution to figure out how to address the issue of slavery. State governments, territory governments have not been able to resolve this. In the vote for or against slavery, you have incidents like Bleeding Kansas where people are like, I don't trust the ballot box, I'm going to choose violence, and that's going to be a problem. But don't worry, the Supreme Court's going to weigh in and come to the rescue. Wait, I read my slide wrong. They're not going to fix it. The Supreme Court is going to look at a Supreme Court case called Dred Scott v. Sanford in 1857, and they're going to rule that African Americans are not citizens and Congress can't ban slavery in the territories. So the Supreme Court strategically steps in, trips over the pot, and falls face first flat on the ground. Or they trip on the rake and hit themselves in the face. Because what they've done here is they've said, Congress, out of the picture. No more compromises on their end. And they also rule to alienate the abolitionists by saying, we don't recognize these people as citizens. It's going to be a mess. Dred Scott, pictured here. Anyways, this just keeps going. It just keeps going. In Illinois, there's a Senate race, and the two contenders over a series of debates, the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, they are going to be all about slavery. There's other issues that America needs to deal with. There's other problems that America is contending with. But increasingly, the first question anyone asks is, what's your stance on slavery? You have to have a stance. So the American public is being pushed one way or the other on this issue. Now, the new Republican Party, with Abraham Lincoln as their candidate, is going to put forth the argument that slavery is morally wrong. They're not going to push for full banning of slavery. They're just going to say, we need to reduce the expansion of slavery. Slavery is wrong. We're not going to push people to give up slavery right off the bat. But he says, we've got to start moving in a way to address this issue. Famous quote, a house divided against itself cannot stand. This half-slave, half-free nation is going to tear itself apart at some point, like 2 years from now. His opponent is Stephen A. Douglas, a Democrat. He supports popular sovereignty. He believes that the United States can remain forever divided, with some parts slaves, some parts not slave. He believes that Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans are too radical and will push things one way or the other too much. Now, Douglas will win the election for senator, but Abraham Lincoln, people will read or have heard his speaking in the debate, and they will realize, this guy is someone worth looking at. And the next time we probably talk, we'll be looking at the election of 1860, the start of the Civil War, and the collapse of things. But that's just a basic introduction to the antebellum period and the growing divide of the American public over the issue of slavery. I hope this helps. Until later.